All right, so good morning. My name is Vasilios Kosmakos. It is Friday, October the 1st, and who do I have the pleasure to speak with today?
Emma Haydocy.
Hello, Emma. So first off, I was wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about when and where you were born, and if you can describe your family for me.
Sure. I was born in 1992 in Springfield, Massachusetts.
All right. And then what did you do as a career? When did you start?
So I found my way into the world of conservation by way of the National Park Service. So I actually started out working in the nonprofit world in affordable housing. My background and degree was in history and political science, focused on the history of conservation movements, was actually where a lot of my work was centered then. And I took an internship with the National Park Service out of the Blue Ridge Parkway, which led me into park ranger life. I traveled around the country doing that. And it actually brought me to South Florida and to the Everglades by way of that. And then finally decided to make South Florida my permanent home back in 2018. I had worked a couple of winters working for the Park Service out of Flamingo and started working for an organization called Florida Bay Forever, which I am now the executive director of.
Fantastic. And then can you tell me a little bit more about what Florida Bay Forever does?
Sure. So we are an organization that is dedicated to protecting and preserving Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. The organization was formed back in 2016 in response to the catastrophic seagrass die-off that we had as a result of hypersalinity out on the bay, and a group of very passionate local residents and fishing guides and community members came together and said, we need to do something about this. And that's how Florida Bay Forever was born. We've evolved since our inception to really focus on educating our local community about the issues facing Florida Bay and how they can engage to make a difference.
Right. Can you describe the type of activities you did in your childhood? So what did you do kind of growing up? Anything nature oriented?
Sure. When I was growing up, I was somebody who always liked to be outdoors. I had a really strong affinity for the water. I was a swimmer, and also enjoyed reading and just being out in nature.
And is there any particular moment or person that kind of really helped you develop that passion for the outdoors?
I don't know if there was any particular moment. I mean, where I lived in Massachusetts was a rural area, so we were always surrounded by water or nature in general. But looking back, actually, I think I always had a conservation ethic always. When my parents were going through this box of old, all your old school stuff that you bring home. And I had actually written a book, I think in like third grade. That was how we can save the rainforest. So I think that's always been instilled in me. And I've always been somebody who's cared deeply about our environment.
Well, that's great. So I was wondering if you can talk about your work in nonprofit work over the years, right? So, what issues do you think have become more prevalent than others? What general trends have you noticed, and how do you think people are interpreting these issues?
And I'm talking about the environment.
Yes. Just kind of in your work as a nonprofit, right? It's like, have you noticed any shifts of consciousness? Have you noticed any issues becoming more kind of pressing than others? That type of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I can only speak for our community here in the Florida Keys. That's where our work is centered. I think that it's hard not to be aware of the environment when you live down here because we're surrounded by water. I mean, you go across a bridge, look out from where I live into the canal. Water is everywhere, and the majority of people directly or indirectly make their living and their livelihoods off of water and clean water. And so when something is not right with water, when there are harmful algal blooms, when we're seeing seagrass die off, when we're seeing fish kills, or when fish are not showing up where they're supposed to, people take notice of it. So I think we in general, down here in the Keys have a more acute awareness of the environment, because it is where we live and where we play and where we work, and everything is dependent on it. And we see direct impacts as a result of that. I think that in terms of Everglades restoration and the world that we work in, that people are aware of it, but I think that there's an access issue there, because these issues are really complex. There are a lot of political bodies that are involved in it on the state and federal level. There are a lot of acronyms. It's just not, there is kind of a baseline fluency that you have to have in the issue in order to be able to really engage with it. And so I think that that's a barrier to folks understanding the issues that we're facing. We try and address that gap through our work. But I think that certainly since the 2015 die-off, we've seen a noticeable shift in our local community engagement on these issues. I think that it's unfortunate that crisis often has to spur that consciousness. But I think that especially with the Everglades, where we've been waiting 20 plus years to see tangible changes and to see action in that area, that it can be frustrating when it takes 15 years for a bad seagrass die-off to happen, for that consciousness shift to happen. But I think that we have seen that shift, and that we have seen a lot of changes in how water managers and how our elected officials respond to these issues as a result of that.
So you mentioned the seagrass die-off a couple times. Would you mind elaborating on that issue?
Sure. So this is not certainly the first time, and I actually know that I saw Eddie Whiteman yesterday, and he mentioned that he had spoken with you. And so Eddie and others can attest to the fact that this is not the first time that we've seen this type of die-off. It just at that magnitude, I would say. So 2015, and really the year leading up to that summer, Florida Bay as a freshwater estuary is dependent upon clean fresh water moving through the Everglades National Park to hydrate the bay to the level that it needs to be. And unfortunately, because of the development of South Florida and the fracturing of the Everglades due to development beginning at the beginning of the 20th century, we see now less than half of the historic flow of water in Florida Bay that we once saw. And so obviously Everglades restoration is supposed to address that, to restore that water. We knew in the 1980s that there was something wrong with the bay, but because of lagging restoration efforts, we have not seen the restoration of freshwater flows. And so our bay is dependent on rainfall for the most part to see the hydration that it needs to stay healthy and to support our communities down here in the Florida Keys. So in 2015, that's exactly what happened. We had a drought that was localized in South Florida. And the thing about that is that it leads to this cascading set of impacts that we see on Florida Bay. So that lack of fresh water leads to hypersalinity, which can lead to seagrass die-off, which then in turn loads nutrients into the water. So we see harmful algal blooms and fish kills, and that cycle can be very circular. And it was just devastating this particular year. We lost 50,000 acres of seagrass in the Central Bay, and impacts were felt up and down the Florida Keys for many months after that. And again, unfortunately, without the ability and capacity to be able to move that water south, really Mother Nature had to save us in that case. And that's how the seagrass die-off stopped, because we weren't moving more water south, but the rainfall came and we were finally able to see those salinity conditions buffered.
So can you elaborate on what you mean by moving water south? So what exactly does Everglades do naturally to kind of promote that? What exactly have we done over the last several decades to mitigate, to stop that natural flow? And what do you think needs to be done in terms of the state and local level to kind of really push that progress forward?
Sure. So what I mean by moving freshwater south, I'll do my little quick Everglades system overview. So the historic Everglades once spanned about 11,000 square acres, and or let me check, 1,100. Sorry about that. I was looking at this morning. So there was this greater ecosystem that spanned from the headwaters of Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Florida Bay. That was once one greater Everglades ecosystem, interconnected. And what would happen is water from the Kissimmee River flows into Lake Okeechobee, and prior to development in South Florida, that water would move over the southern berm of the lake and move south into the Everglades and ultimately to Florida Bay through Shark River Slough or Taylor Slough. And through this development, the Everglades were cut into a million, death by a million cuts, fractured, dammed, diked, and drained to the modern water management system that we have today to support more than 9 million people living, working in South Florida. And so Everglades restoration aims to restore some of that historic flow. And so when I talk about sending water south, we're talking about being able to, and I'll just preface this by saying that this is all because the water is not naturally moving south anymore. We've got roads and water management structures that lie in between us and the lake. And so now it is a matter of being able to store water south of the lake. So take that water, store it somewhere where it can also be cleaned, because as I'm sure you've heard from others who you've been interviewing for this project, the water that is coming out of the lake is not clean and healthy for the Everglades. So it needs to be stored, cleaned, and then conveyed through Everglades National Park and to Florida Bay. And so, the top project that we talk about for this is the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. This is the CERP, or Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan project that aims to restore that historic connectivity and to be able to bring that water south to us. There are also a number of smaller projects that also have the same goal, but the EAA is really the be all end all for projects to help send water south.
And then, so can you discuss, in your opinion, who you think are the kind of major contributors to this kind of dirty water, almost, that you mentioned, right? So, like, is this the sugar industry? Is this like, who's culpable here? If you can answer that.
So I will say that, I think many organizations, and we certainly have been one of them, are critical of the sugar industry for their role in the kind of the destruction of the Everglades, but they are actually not, the polluters. That when it comes to sugar, it really comes down to water supply and controlling when and where the water goes rather than the water quality. But in terms of water quality, and I am no LACO expert, but I mean, when you're looking at what point sources of pollution are, you are looking at things like septic tanks. We are talking about things like fertilizer runoff and just runoff from urban life. All of those things can contribute to nutrient runoff. I would suggest reaching out to Paul Gray if you're really looking to find somebody who is really knowledgeable on point sources of pollution for Lake Okeechobee. But I think it's important to make that distinction that the sugar industry is often, I would say, demonized for their role in the Everglades. But I would be quick to point out that pollution is not it, but water supply is always the concern.
Interesting. So, kind of going off that, right? Would you mind discussing the work you've conducted with a variety of different stakeholders, right? What are kind of based upon your work in the Chamber of Commerce, right? What are the biggest commonalities you see among these different stakeholders, and what do you think are the biggest splits in opinion, and how do you think we can mediate that?
So I'm just for clarity, do you mean like the stakeholder groups that are involved that all play a part in water management?
So let's break it down to two parts. Let's break it down into specifically the kind of local area, right? In terms of with the seagrasses, and then let's kind of talk about just generally water quality.
Okay. So I would say that certainly there is a fracture between the environmental world and agriculture and development. I think that that's a very natural, at times adversarial relationship with any environmental issue. I think, with whatever potential polluter or impacting industries are and the environment are always at odds, whether we're talking about the Everglades or any of a myriad of environmental issues that we have to confront. I would say that at least in the Florida Keys, I think that we, in comparison to maybe a lot of other communities, and again, not as well versed as lakeside communities or those that are on the estuaries, we certainly work with those groups on the environmental side, but that at least in the Florida Keys, we have everybody comes to the table and is in agreement when it comes to the Everglades and water quality, because the environment is our business here. We, again, water everywhere. It is the basis of a more than $2 billion a year tourism economy. It is our lifeblood. And so we have broad support from local chambers of commerce, from business communities, from our elected officials. We have a pretty unified voice down here when it comes to the fact that we need to see clean water flowing south into Florida Bay, and for ecosystem restoration on a broader level, whether we're talking about coral reefs or nearshore water quality. We see really broad support from all industries and sectors. We can all converge on those points. And I think that that's a part of a greater trend really since this seagrass die-off, that we have, I think there's been a great recognition that tourism is the lifeblood of Florida, not just the Florida Keys, but that our entire state is dependent upon clean water to bring people to visit us on our beautiful beaches, coral reefs, et cetera, to visit the Everglades. So I think that there has been a shift statewide on that, in looking at the economic interests that are involved and how ecosystem restoration is really an economic benefit for all.
Great. So kind of based off that answer, right? Would you mind discussing your work with the Chamber of Commerce, right? What have you learned about getting small businesses and more involved in sustainable practices? And what opposition did you face, and how did you overcome it?
So a little before my time with the organization, but the business community here has been super receptive to take action on this. We had there was an active campaign following the Seagrass die-off called the Now or Never Glades campaign, which is really spearheaded here in the Keys by fishermen and business owner Sandy Moret. He owns Florida Keys Outfitters. He has been a voice for the Everglades since really the 1980s, and became really active with Now or Never Glades and rallying the business community as somebody who owns a fly shop and is host to one of the most exclusive fly fishing schools in the country, and certainly here in the Florida Keys. He was hugely instrumental in rallying businesses, and even our organization, our board, much of it was comprised of people whose livelihoods depend on the water, fishing guides, folks who own and operate water sports companies, realtors. So I think it was an easy sell for us here, and it's a pretty easy sell for us here, where those who are not who aren't out on the water every day may not make that connection, but I think they make that connection nicely here, and felt that there was not resistance to that concept at the time.
So, but did you ever experience any resistance with restaurants and the switch to plastic straws, for example, or kind of things like that? So things that maybe don't directly affect the water quality, but maybe things that affect pollution or kind of more abstract kind of concepts like that.
So, I would say for that, I don't think that there has been a huge amount of resistance when it comes to making the transition over to reduce other point sources of point or non-point sources of pollution. We have other organizations, not Florida Bay Forever, but other organizations that are within the, in our community that have campaigns to, for example, go strawless. We've got a Surfrider chapter that's looking at ocean-friendly restaurants. I think it's always, change can be difficult for some folks, but I think that, again, we're acutely aware of what's going on with our environment. So if you were to visit or patronize restaurants or businesses in the Keys, you notice that a lot of them elect to employ more sustainable business practices because they recognize that they're some of the greatest producers of waste that we have in the community. I would also say that one of the things that we confront on a state level is issues of home rule. And this is something that we saw last legislative session with the cruise ship bill. And then there have been plenty of preemptions on plastic bags or straws in other municipalities throughout the state of Florida. And so home rule is definitely an issue that comes into play there. I think that local communities in a lot of places, or at least here in the Keys, I don't know about the rest of the state of Florida, but at least in the Florida Keys, we have local governance that is very aware of the impacts that we have and who work to create and enact policies that improve water quality and the environment overall down here.
So would you kind of mind discussing the idea of home rule, right? So like you said, we have seen, quite a bit of a clause on certain issues, right? Based upon what the state wants and what local communities want. I mean, what do you think could be done to kind of mitigate that, kind of dynamic, that kind of war that's kind of been happening? I mean, do you think communities need to lobby the state more? Do you think voting needs to kind of happen? What do you think can be done?
I would say all the above, especially, so I'll say like Monroe County, we just had our local legislative delegation meeting and we presented our priorities there, but so did every municipality from the county level to the village of Islamorada and every part of incorporated Monroe County in between. And at the top of all of their lists for priority and for our legislators is home rule. And so I think locally, that's a flag that we've been flying for a long time, that, we live in a very unique environment down here and we know what's best in a lot of cases for our communities. Is that always the case? No. And I know that there are probably examples from other parts of the state where that is not the case. But I just have to say that I think that our county, our local communities here along the island chain are really leading the way in when it comes to environmental protections and water quality protections as a result of it being everything to us down here.
So kind of more philosophically now, you've mentioned how small communities are kind of leading the way. And you mentioned that small communities know what's best for their communities, right? But you also just said that sometimes they don't. I mean, what do you think is the best? What do you think is the best way to kind of promote those kind of communities that aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing? What's the best way to nudge them in the right direction? Because there has to be both, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I never think that confrontation is not the best way to, we don't want to call anybody out and say you're doing this wrong. I think it has to come from within, though, to a certain extent, and that when that these communities need the resource and the education to be able to understand what is good for your water, what is bad for, kind of all of that education piece is so critical. And I think that there are a lot of organizations that are out there doing that work, but that there's always more that can be done to raise awareness and to increase awareness and understanding on these issues so that more informed policy decisions can be made.
What do you believe that Florida Forever does better than anybody else? And what do you think, and what lessons do you think what lessons can be learned about what lessons can other organizations learn from what Florida Forever does?
So I think that we have an edge in that we are a locally driven organization. I think that there's totally power in larger national organizations or state organizations that have overarching policy goals and that can activate and that have huge memberships that they can utilize to be able to do that. I think that one of the things that we have done really well is to work on the local level. I mean, I think that is what has been most successful with us, is that we are a local organization that was born and raised locally, and that we continue to work as the southernmost recipient of water management decisions that happen far away from us, but to be able to educate and engage in the way that we know will work for our people, to be able to ensure that they can participate in the process, and that we can see tangible benefit for the ecosystems down here.
So earlier, right, you kind of mentioned how crisis kind of unites us, right? It's like a the salinity kind of thing that happened, and in the Bay, that kind of really kind of was the rallying cry for a lot of these kind of community members. I mean, what can be done though to kind of prevent those crises from happening? I mean, obviously education is important, right? But what specifically can be done to kind of shift that consciousness before those kind of issues kind of exist?
Yeah, so I think it was unfortunate in the case of the 2015 crisis is that we have a plan in place, right? Like, we have this huge piece of legislation that was battled over in the 1990s, that was signed off in 2000, but that required the buy-in and funding from the state and federal government. We need it in order to be able, because this is a massive infrastructure project. Billions of dollars are being spent on this. And so in order to be able to build infrastructure, as I think we're seeing play out on a federal level right now, we saw that there was a lack of buy-in, a lack of funding, and that severely delayed our ability to be able to restore the ecosystem. So we're already working on borrowed time in a lot of ways. And so what can be done is to continue to kind of beat the drum with our elected officials, who are the ones who ultimately are able to propel or delay these projects further. I think that we've been incredibly not lucky, but we are incredibly grateful that since 2015, we have seen legislation passed on the state level that explicitly states out the state's commitment to completing the reservoir project, for example. We have seen full funding since 2018 or 19, but for the past almost 3 years, we have seen full funding from the state legislature, which has then prompted federal partners to put in their fair share. So I think that a part of preventing from what happened in 2015 from happening again is that we keep the momentum going, that we continue to engage with stakeholders and elected officials to restore the Everglades and to pass, enact, and enforce policy that improves and protects water quality. I think that those are kind of some central issues there, and that, you know, what folks need to do everywhere is to continue to make phone calls, write letters, and to remind their elected officials who they serve, and that this is a huge priority that affects all of our communities throughout the state.
So, can you discuss kind of the ecosystem kind of change, right, since this kind of die-off has happened, right? And then also elaborate kind of more on the positive things you've kind of seen based upon the completion of those projects.
Yeah, totally.
In terms of ecosystem, yeah.
That's one of the exciting things I would say is that, from the scientists and the best minds who are out on Florida Bay every day, who are monitoring its restoration and progress. We, for example, are seeing in areas where the die-off happened that we're seeing recolonization of pioneer species of seagrass, who are going to pave the way for us to see thalassia back out in the Central Bay again. Unfortunately, we still don't have the storage and the EA reservoir isn't built. And so we don't have that extra tool in our toolkit, and are still in a lot of ways at the mercy of Mother Nature, which is unfortunate, but is the case even while we're seeing progress towards the construction of that and the completion of that project. But that we have seen that, the fishery is making a comeback. Part of that may be due in part to the fact that we had a huge freshwater inundation with Irma. That's kind of a caveat there, is that we had a huge storm system that came through and was really devastating in some ways. But one of the positives is that it dumped a bunch of fresh water that has helped with rebounding fisheries following the die-off. Seagrass is coming back. And so we also publish a monthly State of the Bay in one of the local papers that we have down here. And if you talk to any fishing guide, they will tell you that there have been noticeable changes in the fishery on the positive side, so that we're seeing the snook fishery rebound, that we're seeing, bigger and more bonefish out in certain areas of the park, that we're seeing a return of more redfish in different areas of the park. So we're starting to see that there, a positive trend and some recovery out on the bay, which is why it's so critical that we continue to keep the momentum going. Because, right now I'll say that Florida Bay is not in the best position ahead of this dry season. We're watching it weekly just to see how the salinities are playing out and how rehydration rates are faring across the park. But I'm concerned. I've been closely watching just to see, it's always an anxiety, I will say, on the back of my mind is, how is Florida Bay doing? Are we going to be hydrated enough for the dry season? And is this going to be, another event like 2015? That is still always in the back of my mind and a major driver of our work.
It's incredibly interesting how we kind of, just stereotypically perceive hurricanes as, these kind of monsters of destruction, right? But like, they have benefits too. I mean, it's like they quite literally saved the bay in this case. So I think that's a fascinating kind of point you're making.
I'll just say too, this is my inner park ranger coming out, but that, like, for example, have you ever been into the park proper?
Unfortunately not, no.
Okay, well, put that on the top of your priority list to get down there. But there are, examples of, obviously it can devastate mangroves. We saw the Keys got flattened in a lot of ways by Irma, but that when we had, for example, Hurricane Donna hit in 1960, that was a huge storm that we saw, one of the places where you can go and take a canoe trip with a park ranger did not have mangroves in that area until Hurricane Donna happened. And since then, that whole area has been colonized with mangroves, and it's a major attraction for folks coming into the park. So the Everglades are incredibly resilient and can adapt. That's one of the beauties of the Everglades, is that it is beaten and battered by these storms, but that there are these biological mechanisms in place throughout the wildlife communities that live there that can bounce back, and perhaps in more ways than we conventionally think about.
That's absolutely incredible. So kind of going back to kind of water quality, right? Do you think that individuals bear responsibility for any positive or negative attributes we've seen in water quality? And what do you think could be done at the individual level to kind of either mitigate or promote those kind of concerns?
So on an individual level, there's so much that people can do to make a difference for our waters. I've already alluded to a few of them, which are making sure that you're engaging with your elected officials, everybody from your local village or city councilman to a federal congressman or woman. Making sure that you're making contact and letting them know that these issues are important to you is so critical. To be able to advance on the policy side of things. I think that, understanding what local policies are already in place, in Monroe County, we have a really strong fertilizer ordinance. And we also, and this was pushed for by the state, but we also are almost completely hooked up septic to sewer. So like our, communities have made the investment, as expensive as it may be, to make changes for water quality. So yeah, educating yourself on not only the issues, but the local policy that you have, local policy issues where there is a public engagement component. And then let me think if there's anything else before I wrap that up. I would also say getting out on local waterways. And I know that that sounds like such a small thing, but I think that the more that we are able to get out and commune with nature and see that water and to explore it and appreciate it, I think that that is just a way to generally foster a greater appreciation, and that can potentially lead to advocacy on these issues further on down the road. So always get out on the water, always get out in the park in your backyard, and that can help facilitate that connection.
I mean, yeah, I mean, people see what they care about, right? And if you aren't using a resource, I mean, you're not gonna understand its value, right? If you're not kayaking or fishing it every single day, I would imagine. So has your area experienced any issues with red tide? I'm St. Petersburg, and that's been a huge issue over the last couple of years.
So red tide has,
or more generally, algae blooms.
Yeah, I mean, so we saw algal blooms forming as a result of the die-off. That's part of that natural cycle, that death cycle, as I like to call it, of, seagrass die-off, and then algal bloom, and then fish kill, and, in this pinwheel of death. I know that, not anecdotally, but when we were hosting our oral history program, that the fishing guides that we spoke with alluded to impacts from red tides in the West Coast that they saw coming down to here. But certainly we do not see or feel that as acutely as the Southwest coast of Florida. I know that historically, even without inputs from human communities or development, that I think that and I may be not a scientist when it comes to red tide in Southwest Florida or on the West Coast, but that has a tendency to happen naturally, historically. And I'm not as familiar with that, but at least that's what my, understanding of it has been, but that it is of course exacerbated by other nutrient pollution in that area.
And then can you discuss kind of the issues you've been facing with climate change? So how has that directly affected the community? Obviously the Keys, right? Super low lying, right? It's gonna be the first one to go type of thing, right? So what issues have you kind of seen since you've been there with climate change? How has it affected you, community members, that type of stuff?
Lot to unpack with climate change on both kind of a local Florida Keys community member level, but also just in terms of the Everglades. So I'll speak to Everglades and then local impacts that we've seen. So the Everglades are obviously at sea level, and it will directly threaten the investment that we've made in restoration, right? So sea level encroachment, sea level rise is a huge issue when it comes to Everglades restoration. It threatens to undermine all this progress that we've made. And it's also changing the landscape for wildlife communities that live out on Florida Bay. So there's some really great research being done out of the Everglades Science Center here in the Florida Keys, where they note and track roseate spoonbill nesting patterns. And the trend has been that these birds are migrating north as a result of a changing climate and rising seas. Same goes for crocodile nesting habits. So some of these keystone species that when we think about the Everglades in Florida Bay, that those are our mascots in a lot of ways, are changing their behaviors in the locations where they live throughout the greater ecosystem because of climate change. The suitable habitat for the American crocodile is set to expand greatly because of rising temperatures, because they are a subtropical species that is really at the southernmost, or excuse me, for them, the northernmost extent and reaches of their range. They're going to be moving further and further north into the state of Florida because there is more suitable habitat, which, I mean, not great when you think about the why behind that, but interesting nonetheless, and how that's going to impact that. And so climate, certainly a huge thing that we're thinking about when it comes to Florida Bay. And then on a local and more personal level, I don't live in in any of the communities I'm about to reference, but there are neighborhoods that are, 15 minutes up the road from me that see 90 days plus of inundation during king tide season because of a changing climate and sea level rise. We have seen, and now we're starting to pay the bill to be able to build the infrastructure to be able to survive the coming decades in a lot of ways. The county and the Army Corps of Engineers are looking at, road elevations and flood protections for homes for storm risk. That is, I think, about $2.7 billion is the price tag for, and we have to split that with the Army Corps. And so there are a lot of, millions and billions of dollars that are currently that we're looking for so that we can make the investment for the decades to come. But then there are also conversations being had about the fact that not every road is going to be elevated, and how do we figure out which communities are going to be, fortified to be able to be more resilient for the decades to come, and that we might have to leave some behind. And these are really difficult questions that we're having to grapple with down here in Monroe County when it comes to climate change. And it's certainly not going to get any easier, but I think that our communities are a model in a way for how a lot of others are going to have to confront these issues moving forward. And certainly Miami-Dade is another low-lying municipality that is confronting those same issues right now, but they have millions of people to have to protect from that. And we in the Keys and Monroe County only have about 75,000 people that we're having to deal with. So still huge, but definitely a huge existential threat to our communities moving forward.
So can you elaborate kind of more on kind of what you said about the expansion of ranges among like different species, right? So it seems like climate change is going to have winners and losers on the species level. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Can you elaborate on it? It's like, how, from a conservation standpoint, how do we go about moving forward?
So, I think, again, I think that the theme that has emerged is that knowledge is power. I think that we have, some great minds who are tracking all of this and who provide the science that we need to make more informed policy decisions. I think that a lot of the organizations that are on the ground doing this conservation work when it comes to wildlife are a part of the larger discussions about the impacts on ecosystem restoration and kind of the bigger picture of all of this. When it comes to like roseate spoonbills moving, maybe that's not necessarily negative, because that means more folks are going to see those beautiful pink birds in their backyard as they're migrating. What I think makes that more challenging is that, that's a keystone species that has been an indicator for how well we're doing at restoring the ecosystem. They tell us, and so if we lose them because they're moving north or going somewhere else, then, what is the new indicator? How are we going to, how are we going to check in on our progress and how well we're doing if we don't have those in place, would be kind of my thought or concern on that.
Interesting. So I think those are all the questions I kind of have for you today, unless you have anything more to add.
Actually, I'm just curious about, what the final product of all of these interviews that you guys are doing is, and what the ultimate goal with the project is.
Yeah, so I'm the creator of the project. It's called the Florida Naturalist Project, and the whole goal is kind of just really document the way. The whole goal is to document the way water quality in our ecosystems have kind of degraded over the last 30 years. So I'm also the creator of the Florida Water Management Project, right, which kind of gives context in the way Florida, on the way water resources in Florida have been managed. So I hope to take this project and take that project and kind of like, combine them so we can have context, but we can also have a reality on the ground on how water and how, has been managed and the effects of that kind of like, within Florida, if that makes any sense.
No, that absolutely does. And I think that I'm, so appreciative of being able to participate in the project. And it sounds like you have been doing outreach to others who have been eyes on the water long before I have, to build on that historical context, because this certainly is not a new issue, but it is one that, we are still in an active and ongoing crisis, across the state for, all of our collective waters. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to contribute in one small part.
Absolutely. And the important thing about this project is that I'm trying to get a really kind of interdisciplinary kind of panel of people, so everybody from archaeologists to fishermen to people like you are kind of more policy oriented, because I think, these are issues that need to be kind of understood from more than one point of view. So, it's a very complex world, and the only way to understand it is by putting these pieces of the puzzle together, So thank you for your time and, your effort. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You have a good one.
Bye.